Hi there. In this introduction lecture, we're going to talk about the O'Kelly variation. So this is e4, c5, knight f3, a6. So yes, a6, is it a useful move in all cases? Can sometimes this move be useless? It turns out it's actually rather useful against d4, and most masters don't play d4. Most masters play other stuff. So the O'Kelly variation, let's have a bit of history first. It's named after the Belgian Grandmaster and third ICCF Correspondence World Chess Champion Alberic O'Kelly de Galway. So it sets up a transpositional kind of trap. White routinely wants to play d4. If you look at online databases, White routinely plays d4, and it's not necessarily by a long stretch the best move in this particular position. That's the funny thing about chess, that in certain positions, moves which you think are totally routine, in other positions they're not very effective at all. So why isn't it that effective to play d4? Black can actually play c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now the most accurate is to hit the e-pawn. The e-pawn, this is one trap already, by the way. The e-pawn can't go forward because guess what black does? This would be a big mistake, losing all advantage straight away because of queen a5 check and then taking out the e5 pawn. So let's assume knight c3, more sensible, but black can now play e5, and let's say knight f3, we have bishop b4. This is super annoying. Bishop c4, let's say bishop c4, queen c7, queen d3, d6. Black doesn't have to take on c3 immediately, and can play like this, can get a dynamic f file, and if the bishop's prompted, can actually just preserve itself, and looking forward to f file play here, and use maybe a f4 later. If we look at this again, if bishop d2, d6, bishop d3, and both sides castle, knight bd7, a3, sure, we can actually give up the bishop here for knight c5. We've got nice pressure on the white centre. It should be slightly better for black. So yes, d4 really, it doesn't seem to be that great here. This is actually an effective move, preventing white's use of the b5 square. And, you know, that is kind of fascinating. So, yeah, let's look at knight f6 again. So this move, if knight b3, bishop b4, bishop d3, black shouldn't go crazy here thinking that d5 is that great. Actually, it's not. This isn't that good. More recommendable is bishop takes c3 check. So let me try and give evidence why. On d5, we can actually take here and just castle dynamically. We can offer this gambit. This is a very strong gambit. Here, rook b1, black's without the kingside knight defensive piece, and actually bishop a3, we're taking away the protection of f7 as well, so there's no defensive knight on f6. The f7 spot is weaker now. Knight c5 hitting b7. Let's say knight c6, white can do better than taking on b7. White can play knight e4 hitting this bishop, and there's a strong attack potential here. All of a sudden black's in big trouble after knight d6. Rook e7, knight takes c8, and we're winning material at the very least. So d5 is not all of that, not all that great. I seem to remember playing Aaron Summerskull in blitz games in this variation, so it brings back some memories, distant memories. But basically, yeah, d5 is not all of that, but bishop takes c3 check, maybe the way to go for black to go. This position is fine for black. Structural damage has been inflicted without too much penalty. Black's king is safe. There's still a defensive knight on f6, so king safety isn't such a problem. Bishop e6, black has a small edge. So okay, so given you know, it's a funny, very funny case where a routine move we take so much for granted is not the strongest move by far, and online players, funny enough, are playing d4 without much thought here. A stronger move, trying to show that maybe a6 is not so relevant to the needs of the position, is setting up the Maroczy bind with c4. So, good ideas persist, like the Morocco bind. It is genuinely a good idea. And, for example, this position, if black tries to play sharply to try and prove something with d4, d takes c5, and we can see one downside of, that pawn on a6 is that it has slightly fractured the dark square grip. It weakened dark squares, and bishop e3, b6, it's another kind of, it's an underminable target. B6 looks miserable, so say e6, knight c3, white has a nice advantage there. So that's a simple way of bypassing all the hassles. c4. This leads white to an advantageous position. Another approach where a6 doesn't seem entirely relevant is to play c3. So, for example, e6, d4, c takes. This, a6 is not always a great idea. And here, white's got a hassle-free center without worrying about c5. This is an advantage for white. Or, here, if d5, trying to get a sort of advanced French, that might be a useful move, a6. But say bishop d7 here, okay, bishop d3. If it's tried for bishop b5, this isn't that great at all. White could play d takes, b4, and target the b5 pawn. So it can't be really that great, there either. C3 is a good idea here, basically. So yes, it seems these other moves like c3 and c4 have great venom in this position. It's funny, it's like a6 has to prove itself relevant to these kind of old school, great ideas, construct a pawn center, construct Morocco bind. Old school ideas persist. You can sometimes play them later. And other moves, you could even just play a king's engine attack as well, and that has to prove itself relevant. If it's for b5 later, it might weaken the diagonal. So, g3, or even, d3, and king's engine attack as an option, or bishop e2, or even b3. Black has weakened dark squares. It's another pawn on a light square. So this kind of approach, kind of Nimzo Larsen style, to put pressure on the dark squares. Black has weakened the dark squares. So, that kind of fits in a kind of logical perspective about dark square grip. Generally, we want to intensify our dark square grip. So it's just a funny case where d4 isn't that effective, and yet most online players are playing this. But it's a little bit tricky. Black has to know what they're doing. So to recap, the best move is knight f6, setting another trap en route. e5 is back as a queen a5 check. So knight c3, and we get this kind of pin variation with a vengeance. So it's funny stuff indeed, I would say. It really is funny stuff. But, okay, so I wouldn't get, as mentioned, you don't want to get too excited about the bishop d3, d5 stuff, because that might kind of backfire. But, I sort of talked about that in the variation with knight b3, bishop b4, bishop d3. So we talked about this. Bishop takes c3 might be the most sensible move, not trying to go for too much. When we use up our defensive kingside knight, maybe expect some trouble later on, because your kingside's without, the soft spot defender on h7. So yeah, bishop takes c3 might be the way to go here, just to recap there. Okay, so a really interesting variation, a kind of trap we can all use and get potentially a really comfortable, fun game with black. Just from a little move a6. So it's Najdorf's move, played super early as the second move. Najdorf had the idea in the Sicilian Najdorf that a6 was a useful move generally, so why not play it early? But that's the earliest you can play it, the O'Kelly variation. And it has got an authoritative figure behind it. Not only an over-the-board grandmaster, the O'Kelly variation, but also an ICCF correspondence world champion. A fantastic player. A truly fantastic player. So a6, what an interesting idea. Okay, I hope you get to try this and have some fun in your online games or more serious games with a6. Good stuff. Thanks so much.